A sudden plan to camp in the deep woods became a memory that still haunts us, even after 10 years. It all started when Brian and I were driving back from a late-night party at a friend's house. Out of nowhere, the car started sputtering. "Please don't do this now," I muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Brian leaned forward, peering at the dashboard as if staring would somehow fix the issue. Before long, the car gave out completely, rolling to a halt by the edge of the woods. We stepped out, shining our phone flashlights on the engine, but neither of us had a clue about car repairs. After a few futile attempts, Brian sighed. "Guess we're not fixing this tonight. Might as well make the most of it." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a pit form in my stomach. "Camping," he said with a grin, pulling a small pack from the trunk. "We've got sleeping bags and snacks. Let's hike in and camp until daylight. We'll figure out the car in the morning." "I'm not in the mood for hiking or camping." "Let's sleep in the car. We'll fix it tomorrow morning," I insisted. The thought of wandering into unfamiliar woods, especially at night, made me uneasy. "Look," Brian said, his excitement undeterred. "This is a golden opportunity. Our moms never let us go camping because of their fears. Now's our chance." He showed me how he had posted in hiking groups and was Googling tips for first-time campers. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing I couldn't stay in the car alone. Armed with some basic gear and Brian's overconfidence, we began our short trek into the woods. Using his social media suggestions, we reached a spot that wasn't too far, but was deep enough into the forest to feel isolated. "Bro, I really don't think we should be here. Forests aren't for first-timers," I said, glancing nervously around the shadowy trees. "Don't worry. We're only here for a few hours. It's already midnight. We'll leave by 6 in the morning," Brian assured me, brushing off my concerns. "What if something happens? What if your precious internet doesn't work out here?" I replied, sarcasm thick in my voice. "Don't be so negative," he shot back. "We'll be fine." Brian's confidence didn't reassure me, but I had no other choice. After setting up sleeping bags and a small fire, we sat around it, sharing stories and snacks. For a while, it was peaceful, just the crackling of the fire, the scent of pine, and the distant hoot of an owl. It almost felt like an adventure. But around 1 a.m., that tranquility shattered. It felt like someone was watching us. When I glanced to my left, I saw 2 men lurking at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. My heart raced as I nudged Brian. He noticed them too. "Who's there?" Brian called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. The 2 men stepped closer, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. They looked disheveled, with wild eyes and ragged clothing. One clutched a rusted crowbar, while the other clenched his fists tightly. "Got any food?" one of them rasped, his voice sharp and demanding. Yeah, sure," Brian stammered, reaching for a bag of chips and tossing it toward them. But they didn't pick it up. Instead, they took another step closer. "Not just food," the other man said in a low, menacing tone. "What else you got?" Fear washed over me like ice water. It was clear these men weren't just hungry, they wanted more, and they weren't afraid to use force to get it. Brian and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing on what to do next. On the count of 3, we bolted, abandoning our gear and running as fast as we could into the forest. The men gave chase, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush behind us. My lungs burned as I sprinted, dodging trees and leaping over fallen branches. The darkness disoriented me, and the forest seemed endless. Every time I thought we'd lost them, I'd hear their voices closer than before. We ran until my legs felt like they would give out. Just when I thought we were trapped, a faint glow appeared in the distance, a cabin. "Over there," I whispered urgently, pointing toward the light. We stumbled toward it, pounding on the wooden door. "Help! Please! Someone's chasing us!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The door creaked open to reveal an old man, his face weathered but calm. He looked us over quickly and, without a word, grabbed a shotgun from the counter. His eyes scanned the woods behind us. "Get inside," he ordered firmly. We barely had time to shut the door before the man fired a warning shot into the darkness. The two men froze in their tracks, their silhouettes visible in the faint moonlight. A second shot sent them scrambling back into the forest. "You boys all right?" the old man asked as he locked the door behind him. We nodded, still catching our breath. He handed us water and motioned for us to sit. "Stay here until dawn," he said. We gratefully collapsed onto the floor, exhaustion overtaking our fear. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, we thanked him profusely and headed back toward the road. After wandering for hours, a passing motorist helped us jump-start our car. By afternoon, we reached a nearby motel, too exhausted to do anything but sleep. That night left us shaken, and though we've gone camping several times since, we've never ventured into the woods again. The memory of that night still gives me chills. My grandpa and his never-ending deep woods, stories you can learn so many things from them. I actually love listening to those stories as they help me understand where he's coming from. His resilience and problem-solving skills are the products of his hiking and camping tales. Many of his stories are super cool, but one still gives me chills. Back in the 1960s, he and his friends took a camping trip. One Saturday, during a particularly stormy night when the power went out, Grandpa told me about it. He began in his low and serious voice. "It was the summer of '68, he said, leaning forward in his chair. "I was in my 20s, full of life and adventure. A group of us, me, your grandmother, and 3 of our closest friends decided to go camping in a remote forest for a weekend to escape the city, enjoy nature, and bond as friends. But it turned into something none of us could forget. The group of friends drove deeper into the forest than most people dared. They wanted solitude with a mix of fun and thrill. The campsite they chose was idyllic during the day, tall trees, a babbling brook, and a clearing perfect for their tents. But as the sun set, the forest transformed. The silence was unnerving. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, not even the distant howl of a coyote. It was as if the forest was mute. "Your grandmother noticed the weird silence first," Grandpa said, glancing at her as she sat quietly in her corner of the room. "She said it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. I laughed it off, of course, told her she was imagining things. But deep down, I felt it too." That night, as they sat around the campfire, the unease grew. They tried to drown it out with laughter and ghost stories, but the weight of the silence pressed down on them. Eventually, they decided to call it a night and retreated to their tents. Grandpa shared a tent with his friend Mike, while Grandma and her friend Linda shared another. The last of their group, Peter, had his tent a bit farther away. "It must have been close to midnight when it happened," Grandpa said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "We were all just starting to drift off when we heard Peter yell. He was screaming his lungs out in panic and fear. Mike and I scrambled out of the tent, grabbing flashlights, and ran toward Peter's camp, but he wasn't there. His tent was empty, and his belongings were scattered as if someone had come and taken him. Panic set in as the group called his name, their voices echoing into the dark forest. After a couple of minutes, they heard him faintly, from deeper in the woods. They followed the sound, stumbling through the underbrush with their flashlights until they found him sitting on the ground, clutching his knees to his chest. "He looked like he'd seen a ghost," Grandpa said, shaking his head. His face was pale, his eyes wide, and his hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the flashlight. He paused and added, "I didn't know what to do." I knelt down beside him, trying to calm him down. Mike also sat beside me. He knew I needed support too. After much coaxing, Peter finally spoke. He said he'd heard a noise outside his tent, like something moving through the bushes, Grandpa said. He thought it might have been a raccoon or a deer, so he went out to check. But then he heard something else, a strange sound, like nothing he'd ever heard before. He said it was a mix of a hiss and a low growl, almost unearthly. Peter, driven by curiosity, had followed the sound deeper into the woods, overriding his better judgment. That's when he saw it. He described it as human-like, Grandpa said, his voice trembling slightly. Tall, with a thin, bony frame, but its face wasn't human. It was like a lizard scaled, with slitted eyes and a mouth that didn't quite fit. And it was making that strange noise, staring at him like it was studying him. Grandpa's expression darkened. Peter told us he was frozen, unable to move. He just stood there. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the darkness. Peter had run, stumbling blindly through the trees until he found his way back to the others. We didn't know what to make of his story, Grandpa admitted. Part of me thought he'd imagined it, that his mind was playing tricks on him in the dark. But the fear in his eyes was real. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and he was genuinely terrified. The group decided to pack up and leave at first light, though the night that followed was tense and sleepless. Peter refused to stay alone, insisting on sleeping in Grandpa's tent. Every sound outside made them jump, their imaginations running wild. When morning finally came, they left the forest in silence, the weight of the night hanging heavily over them. Peter was never the same after that trip. He became withdrawn, avoided his friends, and eventually moved to another city. Grandma said he'd been haunted by nightmares for weeks, waking up screaming about the lizard-faced creature. We tried to get him to talk about it, to see if he'd heard anything similar from others, Grandpa said, but he shut us out. The only thing he ever told me after that was, don't go back there. It doesn't want us there. Grandpa paused, staring into the flickering candlelight. I don't know what Peter saw that night, he said softly. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe it was something we'll never understand. But I've never forgotten the look in his eyes. Whatever it was real to him. The storm outside had quieted by the time Grandpa finished his story, but the room was still. None of us spoke, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy blanket. To this day, I wonder what Peter saw in those woods and whether it's still out there, watching, waiting. Finally, after a year, I went to the deep forest near the Appalachian Trail to escape the daily grind and reconnect with nature. The dense forests, the sounds of chirping birds, and the solitude near the lake were too enticing to resist. I'd been on the trail for a week, moving at my own pace, enjoying the occasional camaraderie with fellow hikers I met along the way, but relishing the peace of solo trekking. One afternoon, as I was cresting a hill, I saw a man with a weathered face, wearing a threadbare jacket and carrying a small, tattered backpack. What struck me most were his teeth, big, extremely yellowed, and uneven, as if he hadn't brushed them for years or maybe months. It was like something out of a bad dream. He waved at me from a distance, and I nodded back, not wanting to be rude. As I approached, he stepped onto the trail, blocking my path. "Where ya headed?" he asked, his voice raspy but overly cheerful. Just to the next shelter," I said, trying to sound casual while keeping my guard up. "Me too," he exclaimed, flashing that unsettling grin. "Mind if I tag along?" I didn't want to be impolite, but something about him made me uneasy. "Still," I nodded. "Sure." As we walked, I kept my answers short, hoping he'd get the hint. But he didn't. He peppered me with questions: where I was from, how long I'd been hiking, and if I was carrying any good snacks. Every so often, he'd laugh at his own jokes, a sound that left me silent. It felt strange, almost as though he was trying to get overly familiar with me. When we reached a clearing, I stopped to tie my boot, hoping he'd go ahead. Instead, he hovered nearby, watching me. "You know," he said, his tone shifting to something almost conspiratorial. "A lot of folks underestimate the woods." Weird things can happen out here. Yeah, I've heard that, I replied, standing up and tightening my pack. Guess I'll see you at the shelter. I started walking faster, wanting to put some distance between us. I wanted my me time. This interaction was too much for me. I had come to be alone, not to force interactions with strangers. When I reached the shelter that evening, I thought I'd lost him. A few other hikers were there, swapping stories and cooking their dinners. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, and I finally began to relax. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, he walked in at a brisk pace, heading straight toward me. My heart sank as I forced a smile to hide my discomfort. "Hey there, buddy," he called out, startling me. He sauntered into the camp like he belonged there, dropping his pack with a thud. "Told ya I'd see you here." The other hikers greeted him with polite nods, but I could see their unease. They seemed to sense something was off about him, just as I did. He plopped down next to me, too close for comfort, and started rummaging through his bag. Every movement felt exaggerated, like he was trying too hard to seem normal. As the night wore on, his behavior grew stranger. He mumbled to himself, then laughed suddenly, a high-pitched cackle that made everyone glance nervously in his direction. At one point, he pulled out a knife, not for any practical purpose, just to hold it, spinning it lazily in his hand. My stomach churned. When it was time to sleep, I chose a spot far from him, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. Sleep came in fitful bursts, and when I woke before dawn, I found him sitting by the fire, staring at me with that same eerie grin. "I think I'll head out early," I muttered, grabbing my gear. "Good idea," he said, not moving. I hiked hard that morning, pushing myself to create as much distance as possible. But by mid-afternoon, disaster struck. While descending a rocky section of the trail, I slipped, landing hard on my knee. Pain shot through me, and I realized I couldn't continue. Limping into the nearest town, I found a cheap motel to rest and ice my injury. The thought of him, his unsettling smile, his strange behavior kept replaying in my mind. I hoped he'd stayed on the trail, far away from me. The next day, as I sat in a small diner eating breakfast, I saw him again. My heart sank. He walked past the window, glancing inside, then doubled back. Before I could react, he stepped inside and sat at the counter, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. "Small world, huh?" he said, sliding to the seat across from me. I forced a smile, trying to mask my unease. "Yeah, I guess so." For the next 10 minutes, he rambled about the trail, the people he'd met, and how he liked keeping tabs on folks he found interesting. My stomach twisted at the implication. After paying my bill, I made an excuse to leave. Back in my motel room, I decided to cut my trip short. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that he wouldn't stop until I confronted him or escaped entirely. The next morning, at 5 a.m. before the sun rose, I slipped out of town, taking a different route back to civilization. Months later, while recounting my story at a hiker's meetup, someone interrupted. "Wait, was he a wiry guy with bad teeth and a creepy laugh?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, why?" The room fell silent. Then someone else spoke. "He's infamous on the trail. Harmless most of the time, but there've been incidents. People disappearing, stuff going missing. Nobody knows his real name." A cold shiver ran down my spine. That man had been far more dangerous than I'd realized. To this day, I make sure to stay among groups whenever I go hiking. I never want to face the same situation again. My peaceful night in the deep woods became a memory I could never forget. Back in the early 2020s, I went on a weekend camping trip in Nevada with my girlfriend, Emily. The desert, vast and quiet, stretched around us as we made our way back to civilization under a blanket of stars. Little did we know a stranger would completely ruin it. It started innocuously enough. Emily and I had just left the last of the campsites, and the long, empty road ahead promised hours of uninterrupted driving. The isolation didn't bother us. It was almost comforting. We had the windows cracked, letting in the cool desert air, and the stereo softly played one of Emily's road trip playlists. Then I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. A large truck, maybe a pickup, was trailing us, its high beams annoyingly bright. I adjusted the mirror and tried to ignore it, assuming the driver would pass soon enough. But they didn't. They stayed close, uncomfortably close. "Do you think they're trying to pass?" Emily asked, unease evident in her voice. "I don't know," I said, trying to sound calm, though my grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Let's see if they overtake us." I eased off the gas slightly to give the truck room to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it stayed behind us, matching our speed no matter how much I slowed down or sped up. It wasn't long before we both became suspicious. "Maybe we should pull over for a minute," Emily suggested. "Let them go ahead." The thought of stopping made my stomach knot, but I nodded. "All right, there's a gas station or something up ahead. We'll stop there." The lights of a small convenience store came into view, a rare oasis in the barren stretch of highway. I turned into the lot, parked near the entrance, and glanced in the mirror again. Sure enough, the truck pulled in behind us, parking a few spaces away. Emily and I exchanged a look. "Stay close," I told her as we stepped out of the car. Inside, I felt a brief sense of relief until I noticed someone standing outside. That's when I realized he had followed us all the way in the truck. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a faded baseball cap. As we stood at the counter to pay, I saw him looking at us. His face wasn't fully visible beneath the oversized cap, but his stare was unsettling. "Let's just get what we need and go," Emily whispered, clutching my arm and motioning slightly to indicate the man's presence. Clearly, she had noticed him too. We hurried outside, but I stopped suddenly. "What are you doing?" Emily asked, alarmed. "I want to confuse him," I said. We ducked behind the shelves and the warehouse section of the store. My experience at superstores came in handy that day. We found a large cupboard to hide in, which had a small hole allowing us to peer out. The man was still there, standing by his truck, waiting. The cupboard held uniforms. We quickly changed our clothes, put on masks, and walked back to our car, blending in. At first, he didn't notice us, but as soon as we sat in the car, the truck's headlights flared to light. He followed us back onto the road. "What?" I exclaimed. "This can't be a coincidence," Emily said, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. My mind was racing, calculating our options. We were miles from the nearest town, and the truck was still tailing us, its headlights glaring into the mirrors. Suddenly, it surged forward, overtaking us on the empty road. For a brief moment, I thought it might finally leave us alone, but then it swerved into our lane and slowed down, forcing me to hit the brakes. "What the hell is he doing?" I hissed, adrenaline spiking. The truck came to a full stop in the middle of the road. Its driver's side door creaked open, and the man began stepping out, silhouetted in the glow of his taillights. "Lock the doors," Emily shouted, fumbling with the button as I slammed the gear into reverse. The tires screeched as I backed up, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The man took a step toward us, his movements deliberate and unnervingly calm. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. Utilizing the clear road behind us, I turned the wheel hard and reversed into a wide arc, spinning us around to face the other direction. The car lurched as I hit the gas, speeding back the way we'd come. Through the rearview mirror, I saw him get back into his truck. Using Google Maps, I quickly chose an alternate route to the city. I made sharp lefts and rights, taking detours to lose him, and eventually stopped at an inn for tea. After a short break, I drove non-stop until we reached the lights of the next town. We headed straight to the police station. Thankfully, it was open. We reported the incident, giving the best description we could of the man, his truck, the license plate, and everything that had happened. The officers were polite but non-committal. "We'll do our best, but we can't promise anything. We'll call you if we find something," one of them said. Exhausted, we finally made it home and collapsed onto the bed, trying to forget what we had faced. Days later, I returned to my normal routine office work and errands, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Unfortunately, we never got answers. The police never followed up, and the man was never caught. Some nights, I lie awake, replaying the events in my head, imagining all the ways it could have ended differently. I remind myself we were lucky to escape, but the fear remains. Out there, in the vast emptiness of Nevada, someone was watching us. And whoever he was, he's still out there. My wife, Sandra, and I love the deep forest. It's our source of peace and solace. That's why we planned a weekend camping trip in the heart of the wilderness. Together, we chose a secluded trail deep in the mountains where few people ever go. When we arrived, the first hour was serene. Birds chirped in the canopy above, squirrels darted across our path, and Sandra even spotted a deer grazing in the distance. We laughed, took photos, and stopped occasionally to catch our breath, soaking in the beauty around us. It was mid-afternoon when we came across a massive fallen tree blocking part of the trail. Its roots stuck up like a web of gnarled fingers. We decided to take a short break there. Sandra leaned against the tree while I wandered around, drawn by something metallic glinting beneath the roots. "Hey, come check this out," I called. Sandra joined me as I crouched down. Beneath the tree was an old, rusted car, its body partially buried in dirt and leaves. It must have been there for decades, a relic of some forgotten accident or misadventure. The windows were shattered, and the once shiny paint had faded to a dull, flaking red. "Wow," Sandra muttered. "How does something like this even get here?" "No idea," I said, brushing away some of the debris to get a better look. Something about the car gave me an uneasy feeling, but I didn't voice it. Sandra, just as curious, peeked inside. Her gasp made my stomach drop. "What is it?" I asked. "Look," she said, stepping back. I bent down and looked through the cracked window. Inside, amidst the rotting upholstery and decaying debris, were several women's undergarments. They were faded and weathered, but unmistakable. "What the hell?" I muttered, a chill crawling up my spine. Sandra backed away, visibly uncomfortable. "Let's go," she said quickly. I didn't argue. The bizarre discovery had sucked all the joy out of our hike. As we prepared to leave, Sandra grabbed her backpack, and I took one last glance at the car. That's when I noticed him. A man dressed in black, with a hood pulled over his head, was walking at a slow, deliberate pace along the trail behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it. Hikers come and go, even on secluded trails like this one. But something about his movements caught my attention, too slow, too purposeful. "Did you see him?" I asked Sandra. She turned and spotted the figure. "Yeah," she said hesitantly. "It's just another hiker, right?" "Maybe," I replied, though my gut told me otherwise. We decided to keep moving, but as we walked, I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder. The man was still there, keeping a steady distance behind us. His hood obscured his face, and he made no effort to call out or pass us, which struck me as odd. "Let's pick up the pace," I said, trying to sound casual. Sandra nodded, sensing my unease. We quickened our steps, hoping to put some distance between us and the stranger. For a brief moment, I thought he was gone. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, there he was again, looking at us. He seemed closer this time. "Something's not right," Sandra whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I said. "Just stay calm." The trip had turned into a nerve-wracking escape. The peaceful mountain air, now felt suffocating. "We need to leave now," I said firmly. "What about our backpacks?" Sandra asked. "Leave them," I said. "Your safety is more important." We abandoned everything: water bottles, snacks, even my camera, and moved as quickly as we could. Thankfully, we still had our wallets, phones, and compass. Using the compass, we made our way toward an area where we hoped to find other hikers. But the fear didn't leave us. The man was still behind us. "I have a pistol," Sandra finally said, to my surprise. "Give it to me," I whispered, still walking fast. She reached into her waistband and handed it to me discreetly. Without hesitation, I aimed between his legs and fired. "Ah!" he yelled, tumbling down. I didn't stop. I fired again, hitting his hand in the other leg, ensuring he wouldn't follow us any further. We didn't wait to see what happened next. Holding Sandra's hand, we ran as fast as we could, leaving everything behind. Eventually, we reached a more populated trail and found a group of hikers. With their help, we called a cab and returned home. As we stepped into the house, Sandra gasped. "No more camping,"